Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India. Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Okay, so today we are going to look at various organizations in the field of civil aviation. In any field, you will see a large number of organizations. Each of them is interested in looking after the aspirations and the requirements of each of the stakeholders. Similarly, in the field of civil aviation, also there are several organizations which have come into being and which, as I said, look after the aspects with which individual stakeholders of the sector are interested. So, broadly speaking, the organizations could be divided as international and national, but we can also look at some divisions, keeping in mind that the civil aviation industry initially bloomed in the United States. So we can look at some organizations in the United States of America and then move on to organizations operating internationally and nationally within India. So if you just take a broad breakup, there are four. The first is the organizations that fall under the umbrella of US federal agency. Then you can consider some organizations as US state agency. We will look at one of them. Then there are organizations which fall under the umbrella of international government agency. We will look at one. And finally, there could be some organizations of relevance to the industry and the trade organizations. So under the US federal agency, we have the Department of Transportation, abbreviated as DOT. We have the Transportation Security Administration, abbreviated as TSA. We have the Environmental Protection Agency, abbreviated as EPA. And we have NTSB, which is the National Transportation Safety Board. Under the US state agency, we will look at only one organization called as NASAO, Nassau. Under international government agency, we will look at International Civil Aviation Organization, abbreviated as ICAO, ICAO. And under industry and trade organizations, the primary organization of the aerospace or the aeronautical industry or the civil aviation industry is IATA, International Air Transport Association. And there are several other organizations which also we will touch upon. Moving on, let us first look at the US federal agencies, and the first and the foremost of those is the Department of Transportation, or DOT. Here I'd like to point out that DOT is not only responsible or concerned with air transportation, it is looking at transportation in general. So it has several agencies working under its umbrella, and they look at air transportation, road transportation, railway transportation, and several other agencies. This organization was founded in April 1967, so it's fairly old organization. It coordinates 13 agencies under its ambit. Okay, The secretary of this organization, DOT, is a member of the Senate, cabinet member of the Senate of the United States, and also he or she is also the principal advisor to the President of the United States of America. So it's a very serious and very responsible position. One important agency coming under the US federal agency is the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. FAA is responsible for various activities, rules, regulations, procedures. It establishes, one of the tasks of FAA is to establish the landing charges. Okay. It also provides the air traffic management or control services within the area controlled by the US. It also issues operational certificates to the carriers. So it gives the operating permits to the various airlines. It also provides the registration of the aircraft operated within the US domain, and it also enforces regulations for safety in operation in the aviation sector. Now, this particular safety enforcement happens all across the industry, at airports, in the airlines, licensing of personnel, approval of procedures, maintenance, and all associated activities. The FAA is divided into 9 subdivisions in the US. As you can see, there are 3 on the eastern side, then there are 3 in the central area and 3 on the western side. Its headquarters are in Washington DC, and the Aeronautical Center, which mainly looks at provision of the air traffic control facilities, is located in Oklahoma City. Okay. The next important agency which comes under the US federal umbrella is the Transportation Security Administration. This is a relatively new agency. It was formed in response to the 9/11 bombings. Before 9/11, the security standards and the procedures followed at the airports were relatively relaxed. But after 9/11, it was realized that it is important to have certain standard procedures and tighter norms, and therefore this TSA was created, which comes under the DOT. Its focus, as you can understand, is on civil aviation safety. Okay, then as and when aviation started to grow in numbers, it started affecting the environment, and therefore the Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970 to look at the environmental aspects of aviation and to set some agenda targets for reduction of the environmental impact of operating airlines and at airports. The fourth agency under the US federal umbrella is the NTSB. Now, there is some history behind NTSB. Earlier in 1926, there was an Air Commerce Act created. Through this act, the Civil Aviation Board, or CAB, was formed. Now, the CAB could not manage all the activities because they were growing at a very large pace, and therefore the CAB became the Federal Aviation Administration. Okay. Then in 1967, the NTSB was created as an agency under the Department of Transportation, but outside the ambit of FAA, and it was separated from FAA but still comes under the Department of Transportation. NTSB essentially has a very specific and dedicated role. The role of NTSB is to investigate accidents or incidents that could potentially lead to accidents. There are several agencies under the umbrella of US state agencies, but we will talk only about one of them, which is the National Association of State Aviation Officials. Okay. As you can see, this is an association of individuals who work in the field of aviation for various states of the United States. Okay. This is an organization that is deeply invested in representing the public interest in all facets of aviation and airport. Okay. So the activities of Nassau are related to ensuring the public interest is served. Then there are several agencies which are coming under the umbrella of international government agencies. The primary such agency is the International Civil Aviation Organization, normally abbreviated as ICAO or ICAO. ICAO is an association of sovereign states of the world. Okay, so the ICAO is a organization created under the United Nations or UN. It has 189 member states in the main assembly of ICAO. There is an ICAO secretariat where the Secretary General and this person's office sits, and there is a ICAO Council which is a subset of the ICAO Assembly and which has 36 member states. Okay. This is a photograph from the first meeting of the UN agency where the creation of ICAO was contemplated, and it is interesting to note that India was also represented in this particular meeting. So India has been a member of ICAO right from the beginning. Okay, the headquarters of ICAO are in Montreal in Canada, and all over the world it has 7 regional offices. So for us in India, we come under the Bangkok regional office. There is one in Cairo, there is another in Paris, there is one in Dakar, there is one in Nairobi. Then there is the headquarters in Montreal, which covers both the North America and Canada. There is one in Mexico, and then there is one in Lima. So these are the 7 regional offices of ICAO. Let us have a look at the role of ICAO. This, as I mentioned, was set up under a Chicago Convention of 1944. So this is under the United Nations. Okay. The aim of ICAO is standardization of global air transport and ensuring safe and orderly growth. So when we look at standardization, ICAO has taken many initiatives. For example, ICAO sets the aircraft emission standards for hydrocarbons, that is the HC, carbon monoxide, that is the CO, nitrous products of nitrogen, that is NOx. These are the 3 elements which define the amount of emissions coming out of engines. And then for local air quality or LAQ near airports, ICAO emission standards for soot and suspended and particulated matter are released. Okay, so near the airports you have let's do it again. Near the airport you have a lot of suspended particulate matter. Okay, and that affects the quality of the environment, or the quality of the that affects the quality near the airport. And from the engines, the emissions of these products is what ICAO regulates. ICAO has also given some noise regulations. Whenever aircraft operate, they do generate noise. Now there are 2 basic aspects. One is the noise created by the aircraft to the communities near the airport, and the other is the noise created by the aircraft for the people sitting inside the aircraft. There are some norms and standards for the cabin noise also, but mainly the noise regulations are for the effect it does on the general public and the people who are outside. So there are certain noise regulations which we will study in more detail later. As far as the environmental efforts of ICAO are concerned, there was a very interesting Corsia agreement in 2016, which was an agreement in which all member states in the world, they came together and took a pledge that the global aviation emissions will be reduced in 2050 to 50% of what they were in 2005. Okay, so if this is the level of global aviation emissions in 2005, they will be halved in 2050 by collective efforts of all member states of the ICAO. That is what was resolved in 2016 Corsia Agreement. And just like NTSB does investigation of aircraft air disasters, accidents and major incidents, mainly for the American owned territories or airlines operated or registered in America. Similarly, ICAO carries out investigation of accidents that happen in the international airspace. In recent times, unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, as they are loosely called, are proliferating, and they are going to be a huge problem for maintaining separation with the other agents. So ICAO has come up with certain drone regulations and procedures for drone registrations so that we can try to regulate the growth of this particular field. ICAO, as I mentioned, also believes in standardization so that all over the globe uniform standards are being followed. In the field of air navigation, ICAO has come up with National Aeronautical Information Publications, or AIPs, which are issued by each member state. And there is a requirement that any change in the infrastructure or in the frequencies or the availability or non-availability of facilities, creation of new facilities, all of that should be reported in the AIPs, and these should be updated monthly so that people are able to remain current with the knowledge about the facilities available or not available. ICAO came up with the Aeronautical Message Handling System, or AMHS, which allows communication between various aeronautical entities. ICAO classifies the airports into various categories based on reference codes. There is a reference code number and a reference code letter. The reference code number indicates how much field length or how much runway length is required by the aircraft to operate safely. So higher the reference code number, longer is the runway length required by an aircraft. Similarly, as a surrogate of the size of the aircraft and the width of the runway that is needed for it to operate safely, ICAO comes up with reference code letters for every aircraft based on the wingspan or the outer main landing gear span, whichever is more critical. So by wingspan, we mean the distance from tip to tip of the aircraft wing. That is the wingspan. And by the outer MLG span, what we mean is MLG stands for the main landing gear. Every aircraft generally has two landing gear segments. There is an auxiliary landing gear. Usually it's in the nose, so we call it as a nose landing gear. But small aircraft have an auxiliary landing gear at the back, so it's called as a tail landing gear. Okay, tail gear. So the distance between the main landing gear, okay, and the nose, as well as the distance between the main landing gear and the tail, is very important. But here what we have done is, ICAO has looked at the maximum span. That means the distance between the outermost tires of the main landing gear leg of the wheel. That is an indication of how much width the runway would have to be to operate a particular aircraft. So either that or the wingspan, whichever is more critical, decides the aerodrome code letter from A to H, where again A is small and H is larger. This is a topic which we will cover in more detail when we look at the airport sizing and layout exercise. Just like internationally we follow a unit system called as the SI system, similarly in the field of civil aviation, ICAO has standardized which unit should be used preferably for which particular parameter. So for the cruising speed, cruising velocity, cruise, they have come up with the requirement to give it in kilometers per hour, the landing speed in meters per second, the distances traveled in kilometers, and the elevation from the ground in meters. So ICAO standard for altitude is meters, for distance is kilometers, for landing speeds is meter per second, and for cruising speed is kilometers per hour. The aim of this exercise is to ensure that when people report the information, they follow the same units all over the globe. ICAO has also classified or assigned a 4-letter code to each airport in the world and a 3-letter code to each airline in the world. For example, Mumbai Airport has the code letter VABB. In fact, all airports in India, the ICAO airport letter code starts with V. Okay, so VABB is Mumbai Airport, and AIC stands for Air India. You can loosely call it as Air India Corporation, but it's just a 3-letter code for the airline given by ICAO. So whenever ICAO refers to something related to Air India, they will call it as AIC, and whenever they talk about Mumbai Airport, they will call it as VABB. Then ICAO also is responsible for registration of the aircraft and to give a type designation for each aircraft type in the world. So for example, aircrafts registered in India are given a registration VT and then 3 digits. Okay. Similarly, B741 is one of the models of Boeing 747, probably 747-100. So whenever you want to refer to that aircraft, ICAO has given a code B741. Similarly, there is a code called as A321 or A320, like that. So this is the way in which it ensures standardization. Okay. In recent times, ICAO came up with machine readable and biometric passports so that the forgery of passports can be addressed to a large extent. Not every passport in the world is machine readable or has biometrics, but quite a few of them do have. And once again, drone regulations and registrations, the procedure for that is being set up by ICAO. Let us now look at some industry and trade organizations. The main organization in the field of civil aviation is the International Civil Aviation Organizations, or IATA. All scheduled airlines in the world are a member of IATA. Okay. So you can see there is a huge traffic between various points. This is a figure from Europe. It shows how much traffic can be there in a small area of the world. Okay. So why we need IATA? We need IATA for industry-wide standardization and industry-wide give and take, so that people can associate together and help each other. Okay. One of the roles of IATA is to have a standardized procedure by which the flight information is reported. Then IATA has come up with this standardized baggage tag, which can be used with barcodes, etc., to quickly handle and transfer the baggage. And IATA has also come up with a commonly permitted size of the carry-on bags, both the checked-in bag as well as the carry-on bag. Notice that different airlines may permit different amount of different weight in pounds that you might be allowed to carry. Okay, but the dimensions, 22 inches by 14 inches by 9 inches, these dimensions have been arrived at uniformly by IATA, and they are applicable now all over the world. Let us spend some time looking at the focus areas of IATA. Okay. One of the major activities of IATA is the IATA Operational Safety Audit, or IOSA. This was initiated around 2 decades ago in 2003. IOSA is an audit of airlines' operational management and control systems. Every airline has to get themselves audited by IOSA at some frequency. Then IATA has also done several things to simplify the air transport business and to bring in some commonality. For example, the issue of electronic tickets, barcoded boarding passes, self-service baggages. All of these are initiatives which have been proposed and encouraged by IATA, and now they are standard all over the industry. Just like ICAO, IATA is also interested in environmental impact reduction. The difference is that ICAO is a body of member states. So these are the countries who come together and give a pledge. IATA, being a body of airlines, it motivates airlines to come together and promise certain reduction or some initiatives for reduction of the environmental damage. So IATA has managed to convince airlines that they should aim for 1.5% improvement in the fuel efficiency from 2009 to 2020. They have decided to enforce a cap on the aviation net carbon emissions from 2020 onwards to ensure carbon neutral growth. And as I mentioned, 50% reduction in net aviation carbon emissions by 2050 as compared to the ones in 2005. So the Corsia 2016 agreement has been ratified by IATA. So now the airlines also are committed to come together and create initiatives for reduction of the carbon emissions. IATA also provides many services. Training services, and also there are many publications of IATA which are very useful for the airline personnel in planning and management and operation of the airline. Okay, let us look at some other industry organizations. There are quite a few of them, so we will not be able to cover all of them, but we will look at a few of them. Okay. AIA stands for Aerospace Industries Association. This is an association, as the name suggests, of organizations and companies that work in the field of aerospace industries. Then you have AOPA, which stands for the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association. As you can see, this is an association of people who own aircraft and people who pilot their own aircraft. Then you have ALPA, which is for the airline pilots. It's the Airlines Pilot Association. All pilots of commercial airlines are members of ALPA. It looks after their own interests. Then there is ACI, the Airports Council International, which, as you can imagine, is an association of various international airports. And then you have ATA, or the Air Transportation Association, which is another organization, and we are actually going to look at some ATA initiatives, especially in the area of arriving at the procedure for estimation of the direct operating cost of an airline. And also they have subdivided the aircraft sub-assemblies into various categories and numbers. Let's move to some other industry and trade organizations. There is this AAAE, Association of American Airports Executives. Okay, so these are all people who works as executives at airports, and it is their association. Then we have GAMA. GAMA is the Association of General Aviation Manufacturers Association. What is general aviation? General aviation is a class of civil aviation which is used by people who own their own aircraft or for non-commercial purposes, such as a company that provides service to its executives through their own company jets, or a family that goes from A to B by their own aircraft, or some professionals, doctors, lawyers, and professionals who fly to meet their clients by their own aircraft. Such aircraft come under the category of general aviation, and the association of the manufacturers of such aircraft is GAMA, GAMA. Then you have Helicopter Association International, which is, as you can imagine, a body of helicopter producers and operators. There is also a Regional Airlines Association, which looks after the specific requirements, concessions, and facilities that should be provided to the regional airlines to promote civil aviation in remote areas. Okay, moving on. Let's try to look at some aerospace organizations within our country. Let's look at some aerospace organizations in India. The primary agency in the country which is responsible for the civil aviation operations is the Directorate General of Civil Aviation, or DGCA. It comes under the Ministry of Civil Aviation. The main aim of DGCA is to ensure safety in operation and to regulate the field of air transportation, to promote civil aviation, to regulate air transportation and to promote civil aviation. DGCA is responsible for aircraft registration, rules and regulations for operating aircrafts in India. They are the ones who set up the policy for issue of licenses of aviation personnel. They conduct examinations for giving the type certificates for aircraft and for the licenses of the engineers. So they have a lot of responsibility on their shoulder. Another organization in India which comes under the government sector is the Airports Authority of India. The main aim of AAI, or the Airports Authority of India, is to manage and operate the airports as well as provide the air traffic services and safety services like search and rescue in case of any incident. Then, just like we have TSA in the US, we have an agency called as BCAS, Bureau of Civil Aviation Security, which lays down the security standards for operating in India. Then, as and when airports started becoming commercial and there was a need felt for economic regulation of the airports, hence recently an agency called AERA was created, the Airports Economic Regulation Authority. And just like we have NTSB and ICAO investigating accidents within US and in international waters, you have an Aircraft Accident Investigation Board, or AAIB, which investigates accidents in India. I wish to talk also about one very interesting organization called as the IWPA, as you can make out by the photograph. It is an association dealing with women. Initially, this organization started as the Indian Women Pilots Association, or IWPA, but soon when they realized that women are entering various aspects of aviation, so they renamed themselves as the Indian Women Professionals in Aviation and Air Force. Okay. So IWPA is currently chaired by Dr. Mrs. Harpreet Singh, who is seen in the red sari in the center among the photographs of the pilots and the other lady in black. And recently we conducted an event in IIT Bombay in which IWPA also participated. So Dr. Harpreet Singh also had come to help us out with that particular event. All right, let's have a look at some freedoms of the air. As you know, the UN in its 44th convention at Chicago came up with a lot of discussions regarding how much freedom should be given to member states for commercial operation of airlines between the member states. And after a lot of discussion, certain basic rights and freedoms were decided. The initial list was only 5 freedoms, but then there were more freedoms given, and now we are looking at 9 freedoms, of which the first 5 freedoms are generally considered to be acceptable by all the member states. The last 3 freedoms are the ones which have come up recently, and these are also generally assumed to be available. But please note that all these agreements or all these freedoms, please note that all these freedoms actually come only within the bilateral and the multilateral treaties that are there between the various countries. Let us have a look at some freedoms of the air which have been decided to be given mutually to the states, the member states of ICAO. During the 44th convention of ICAO, there was a lot of disagreements and discussions between various member states. Many member states were worried that the US, because of its very well established and large air transportation industry, if they were given all the rights and freedoms, they might dominate and they might have a huge commercial advantage over other countries. But broadly speaking, certain freedoms of the air were decided, and they have been documented in the Manual on the Regulation of International Air Transport, Doc 9626 Part 4. So what are these freedoms? Let us have a look at them. So essentially today there are 9 freedoms of the air. So the first set of rights which were agreed upon mutually is called as the transit rights, under which we have the first and the second freedoms. These are broadly considered to be fait accompli and granted to everybody by virtue of being a member of ICAO. But then a member state has a right to waive this freedom at any point of time. The second set of rights were the third freedom and the fourth freedom, which is related to traffic, carriage of traffic on both sides. Beyond the rights, there were 2 more freedoms given, which were the 5th and the 6th freedom. And then finally, there was a series of freedoms given under the term cabotage. Cabotage in aviation, civil aviation, means the permission to transport goods within one city to the other city in a foreign country. That is called as cabotage. So we will look at all these freedoms now one by one. The first freedom is the most basic freedom, and that is the right or the privilege in respect of the scheduled international services granted by one state to another state or states to fly across its territory without landing. So for example, there is a country B in the center. The airspace above this country is the sovereign property of that country. So nobody can enter that airspace normally without permission. But under the first freedom, it is assumed that permission to enter your airspace is automatically provided, and yes, you can charge for the provision of services in your airspace or for the usage of your airspace. So because the airspace above your country belongs to you, when an aircraft is overflying, they have to pay some overflight charges. These charges normally are a function of the distance traveled in over your territory. Okay. So for example, there is an aircraft which wants to go from country A to country C, and during that flight it is flying over country B or many countries like B. Under the first freedom, it is assumed that the country B has given de facto rights for country A to go over it and to land it in country C. An example of the first freedom is a flight from Canada to Moscow. An example of the first freedom is a flight from Canada to Mexico flown by a Mexican airline flying over the United States. So imagine that A is a city in Mexico and C is a city in Canada. So a Mexican airline starts a flight from A and goes to Canada, and during that process it flies over USA, and it is assumed that USA has given the right to Mexico to fly over its sovereign territory to land a flight in Canada. Please note, this is what is notionally assumed, but it is within the right of USA to refuse this freedom in case the relationship between the two countries have an issue, or for some reason if country B does not want aircraft from country A to go over its airspace, it can refuse permission. Here is a map of the airspace which is controlled by India. You can notice that the airspace covers not only the political boundaries of the country, but also large areas over the ocean, both on the left and the right hand side. This is because the responsibility of providing air traffic and navigation services in these oceanic areas has been taken by India. Further, the airspace controlled by India, which spans over 6 million square kilometers, is divided into certain FIRs or flight information regions. There is a Delhi FIR, there is a Mumbai FIR, Chennai FIR, and Kolkata FIR. Okay, so you can see that any aircraft that travels, let us say, along this route, when it enters the Mumbai FIR till it leaves Mumbai FIR, for that entire duration, when it flies, the air traffic management services have been provided by Indian air traffic controllers, and therefore a small fee will be charged by the Airports Authority of India to each carrier for each flight that take place over the airspace. Similarly, when an Indian aircraft flies over foreign FIR, it has to also pay some amount of money. A question arises, is the entire Indian airspace available for commercial flights? No, that's not the case. There are certain areas which are either prohibited or restricted or notified as dangerous areas, because some testing or a flight activity takes place in those areas, and any civil airline or civil aviation activity will be nice to avoid that area because there are dangers in that. The restricted airspace normally is over the defense establishments of the country. Okay, then there are also some no-fly zones. For example, flights exactly above Taj Mahal are prohibited because Taj Mahal is a no-fly zone. The Parliament building in New Delhi is another area which is a no-fly zone. Then many defense and air force bases, we don't allow other aircraft to fly in that area. There is a Tower of Silence in Mumbai where the Parsis cremate the dead people, and that is also as a mark of respect, nobody is allowed to fly over the Tower of Silence. And also the Rashtrapati Bhavan, the seat of the power of central government of India, that also is not permitted to be overflown by any aircraft. As I mentioned, the first freedom is something that is notionally assumed, but it is possible for a country to ban the flights from another country. It happened recently in February 2019. After the Balakot strikes in North India, Pakistan closed its airspace in India. So you can notice that all the aircraft which are flying from India towards the east or the west side, they have to now circumvent the airspace of Pakistan. Okay. So overnight there was a requirement to reroute the flights to obviate or bypass the need to travel over Pakistan. This costed the airlines in India more than 500 crore rupees Okay, so somewhere in February 2019, just as an aftermath of the Balakot strikes, this airspace was banned by Pakistan. But this airspace was reopened in the month of July the same year. Why was it reopened? One main reason is that closing an airspace is a huge financial burden for a country. Because as I mentioned, every time an aircraft flies over the airspace controlled by you, you get paid some charges, navigation charges. And it can be a huge amount. It can actually add a lot to the country's economy. So by banning the airspace to Indian airlines, Pakistan was losing money every day. And in July 2019, they opened their airspace again for the Indian aircraft. All right, so that is the first freedom, the notional permission to fly over any country to apply to the third country. The second freedom is the right or a privilege in respect of a scheduled international air services granted by one state to another state or states to land in its territory for non-traffic purposes. So this landing can be for anything. It could be emergency. It could be for any other operational issues. It could be for maintenance. But you are not dropping passengers. You are not carrying passengers. You are only making a technical stop, as they say. Okay. So for example, an aircraft takes off from country A, lands in B for maintenance or technical reasons, maybe for refueling, maybe for some issue. Sometimes there is a problem when an aircraft is hijacked. At that time also, you are you can request permission to land in a particular country, because that's also an emergency. One example of this particular freedom is a flight from UK to the USA flown by a British airline refueling at an Irish airport. So imagine this A represents UK and C represents USA and B represents Ireland. So because of the long distance, there was a requirement earlier. There were no non-stop flights between UK and USA. The aircraft at that time did not have enough fuel capacity to do a non-stop flight. And also there were restrictions on the path because of the number of engines. This we will study when we look at air routings. But it is possible, for example, for an aircraft to take off from a city in the UK, say London, land at a base like Shannon in Ireland, and then refuel and then proceed its flight further ahead to USA. Such a kind of a notional freedom was considered to be available under the second freedom of the air. However, this has to be negotiated and approved. Okay, you simply cannot say, yes, in an emergency you can say, look, I have an emergency, therefore I would like to land in your country. Okay, technically speaking, country B can refuse also. But generally it is considered that if you are a member of UN, this particular freedom will be given to you. So these two freedoms were basically the transit rights. Okay, the third freedom is the traffic right. Now this is the right or privilege in respect to of scheduled international services granted by one state to another state to put down in the territory of the first state traffic coming from the home state of the carrier. Okay, so now you are saying that I will carry traffic from my country to your country. Okay, this is a freedom. So an aircraft takes off from country A, lands in country B and drops its passengers. One example of this is a flight from New Zealand to Japan. Imagine A is New Zealand and B is Japan. A flight from New Zealand to Japan flown by a New Zealand airline. So it takes off from New Zealand, from a city in New Zealand, lands in Japan and offloads the passengers. And the fourth freedom is the reverse. In the third freedom, we have given the right to take off from your country, land in the foreign country and drop passengers, which means you are carrying passengers from your country to a foreign country. The fourth freedom is just the reverse. You carry passengers from a foreign country to your country. So the right or privilege in the territory of the first state, traffic destined from the home state of the carrier. So this is the home state. Let's say an example. So a flight from Chile to Brazil flown by a Brazilian airline. Okay, so this is Chile, this is Brazil. So from Brazil you pick up passengers and land in, from Chile you pick up passengers, land in Brazil. This is the fourth freedom. So these two are called as the traffic rights. And then we have other rights. This is the fifth freedom. In the fifth freedom, you allow traffic coming from the destined to a third state. So let us just see one example. So take off from A, land at B, pick up passengers and proceed to C. Okay. So flight from Melbourne, Australia to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia with a stop in Denpasar, Indonesia, flown by a Malaysian Airlines. Passengers and cargo may travel between Melbourne and Denpasar with no intention to continue to KL. So once again, let us see what is happening. You take off, pick up the passengers and proceed further. The sixth freedom essentially is the right or privilege, okay, for traffic moving between two other states. So now this is the home state B, and an airline from this country B is taking off from country A, and then the passengers are meant for country C. So he takes off from A, lands at B and then goes to C and drops the passengers. Okay. So the passengers who take off from here, they could be for the home state or they could be directly wanting to go here, but they are going via the home state. One example is a flight from New Zealand to Colombia flown by an airline based in Chile with a stop in Chile. So this is Santiago, Chile. Okay. This is New Zealand. This is Colombia. So from New Zealand, you land in Santiago and then you proceed to Colombia. The seventh freedom is more interesting. The right or privilege in respect of scheduled international air services granted by one state to another state of transporting traffic between the territory of the granting state and any other third state with no requirement to include on such operation any point on the territory of the recipient state. So one example of this. So there is an airline which belongs to country A. It takes off from country B with passengers and lands in country C. There is no need to come to the home state. In the previous freedom, it was coming via the home state. It was carrying passengers from A to C via B. It was stopping in B. Here there is no requirement. You are an airline. An example of this could be a flight between Spain and Sweden. This is Spain, this is Sweden, and this is an Irish airline. So an Irish airline is flying an aircraft from Spain to Sweden. No need to come to Ireland. The eighth freedom is called as consecutive cabotage. In consecutive cabotage, you start from your home state, go to one city in the foreign state, drop passengers, and then you could actually again travel from that place to this place. Okay. So between these two cities, it is acting like a domestic carrier. Between A and A, it's acting like a international carrier. So a flight operated by Indian Airlines between Delhi and SFO, that is San Francisco, with a stop. So this is San Francisco, this is New York, this is Delhi. You fly from Delhi to New York, stop there, and then you fly from New York to San Francisco. Okay. So some people from A may be only for New York, some may be from A for SFO, and some may also be from A to B. But you are doing this way and then doing it. The last freedom is the utmost, and that is called as a standalone cabotage, which is actually very simple. An airline from a country A can act like a domestic flight from one city to other city in some other country. Previously, in the eighth freedom, you had to take off from your country, take passengers to a foreign country city, and from there become a domestic airline. In the ninth freedom, okay, you just act as a domestic carrier. Example of this would be a flight between Paris and Lyon by Air India. So Air India is based in this country, but it flies only between Paris and Lyon. That is the ninth freedom of the air. Thank you very much for your attention.